You are listening to the Beyond Canon podcast.
Dear listeners, friends, and fellows, we wish you a very warm welcome to the next episode of our Center for Advanced Studies Beyond Canon podcast. My name is Charlotte von Schelling, and I am the editorial assistant at Beyond Canon. And today it is my great pleasure to welcome our next guest of the podcast, Dr. Daniel M. Gurtner, who since 2020 is an external affiliate at the Center for the Social Scientific Study of the Bible at St. Mary's University in Twickenham, London, in the UK. So, dear Daniel, we are very happy that you agreed to be a part of our podcast series. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So maybe as an introduction, we could just start with you introducing yourself to our listeners and telling us a bit about yourself.
Sure. As you can probably tell from my accent, I am an American,
Yes.
I did my PhD at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland with Richard Bauckham, and I work primarily in the New Testament, and that's where I've taught in American seminaries for 15 years before the appointment at St. Mary's. So, I primarily research and write in the New Testament, especially the Gospels, as well as their Jewish background. And so for me, working in the subject matter that we're going to discuss today is somewhat secondary, but is nonetheless important for my work.
That's so interesting. You have intercontinental relations through and through, also to Europe. And it's so nice to hear from different biographies of all our associates and fellows, whatever connections they have around the world. So some Scottish American connection we have here today. And we know that a field you specialized in are Jewish Apocrypha or Pseudepigrapha. So maybe you could please tell us, how did you come to deal with it in the first place? And could you explain to us the difference between these two terms, or do they also have some things in common?
The terms are actually somewhat confusing. So let me go back a little bit and explain how I got into it. I'm really interested in some of the context of Second Temple Judaism as a context for studying the New Testament Gospels. So that is really how I got involved in the subject matter. And I'm writing a commentary on the Gospel of Matthew right now. And so this information is feeding into that quite well. The Apocrypha, now we're talking about Old Testament Apocrypha. As we think about beyond canon, you also deal with New Testament Apocrypha, but this is Old Testament Apocrypha, and that's pretty easily defined. These are Jewish writings that are found in one of the three major Greek codices of Scripture that are not found in the Hebrew Bible. Mm-hmm. So the book of Tobit, Susanna, First and Second Maccabees, these sorts of writings are all part of what are called the Apocrypha. So that's pretty easily defined, although there's some debate as to which books to include and which not to include. The difficulty with the Pseudepigrapha is that it's not easily defined. It's sort of historically been defined as anything that is not among the Apocrypha, not among the Dead Sea Scrolls, not among Philo or among Josephus.
Wow. Yeah.
So it sort of becomes a catch-all category. The terminology is misleading in English. The term pseudepigrapha means false writing or falsely attributed writing. So the idea is that somebody is writing in somebody else's name. It's sort of like maybe reverse plagiarism. So if I were to write something and I wanted to have it widely read, I might write something in the name of Professor Tobias Nicholas and write in his name. And in doing so, I might be doing it to get a wider readership, or I might be doing it to pay homage to somebody who has influenced me or something like that. And so readers really don't know who the real author is. But there could be a variety of reasons why somebody would do something like that in history. So technically, that's what the term pseudepigrapha means. And the Old Testament pseudepigrapha in particular are ones that are written in the name of Old Testament figures. So there's the Testament of Abraham, there's the Testament of Job, there's the Apocalypse of Enoch, and these sorts of things named after figures and using these figures' names that appear in the Old Testament and claim to be written by or associated with them, but are not really written by them and associated with them. It becomes a bit of a puzzle because some of the works actually fit that description. So, for example, there's an apocalypse called Second Baruch, and it claims
Yeah.
to be written by Baruch, who was the scribe of Jeremiah. And the idea is Baruch is trying to appropriate a lot of the ideas from the experience of Jeremiah into his own day after the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. And everybody knows Baruch didn't write it, and there was no intent of deception or anything like that. But there are also plenty of writings that are included in the Pseudepigrapha that don't do that at all, that make no attribution to authorship in any of these kind of capacities or any relation to Old Testament figures. So defining the term technically means falsely attributed writing, but it generally includes works that are much more broad than that. What I've tried to focus on in my work on the Pseudepigrapha is, like I said initially, that I focus on Second Temple Judaism, which
Yes.
I define up through about 135 CE, which is the end of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the second
Hmm.
Jewish revolt against
Hmm.
Rome. There are pseudepigrapha that are written after that time. There are
Hmm.
pseudepigrapha that are written by Christians after that time in the name of Old Testament figures. So for me, I work with the texts that are focused on the pseudepigrapha, so this broad category, and ones that are written from a demonstrably Jewish context
Hmm. Hmm.
and date from about 135 CE or earlier.
Ah, that was a great insight. Thank you so much. And one keyword you already mentioned was that you are working on pseudepigrapha of Second Temple Judaism. And that actually is also a part of the title of a book you recently published, right? Introducing the pseudepigrapha of Second Temple Judaism, message, context, and significance. We would like to know what your main research interest was while you were writing this book and what it has to do with our idea of Beyond Canon.
Yes, thank you for that question. My main research interest was to familiarize myself and other readers with an assortment of documents that tend to be very confusing. As I mentioned, these texts, some of them are Jewish, some of them are Christian, some of them are early, and some of them are late. But in most published editions, in English as well as in German, the editors don't make any distinction. They put them all
Yeah.
together. And
Ah.
so a user who wants to read some of these works really has very little means unless they're willing to read through all the introductions of some of these works in these collected editions. They have really no means of discerning which ones are in fact Jewish and which
Mm-hmm.
ones date from the Second Temple period.
Mm-hmm.
So my
Mm-hmm.
main interest was to explore the significance and contexts and interrelationship of these writings that again are demonstrably Jewish and date from 135 CE or earlier. My purpose in particular is to ultimately be well informed in my interpretation of the New Testament, but the book is certainly not focused on that by any stretch of the imagination. So, and what it does is, in terms of the addressing the issue of beyond canon, is for most Catholics as well as Protestants, they don't know anything about these books, and they're, except for our Ethiopian Orthodox friends who would be familiar with the Book of Jubilees as well as the Book of First Enoch.
Ah.
Most readers really have no familiarity with any of these at
Mm-hmm.
all.
Mm-hmm.
So and yet when we read, for example, in the New Testament, in the Book of Jude, it gives a quotation from the Book of First Enoch. The Book of James makes reference to ideas of the sufferings of Job from the Testament of Job, and they seem to be familiar with some of these writings that otherwise we know nothing about. So, to some extent, what I'm trying to do is familiarize readers with this assortment of documents that are not part of, most of them are not part of any canonical list or canonical collection, but are nonetheless familiar to, if not to the New Testament readers, at least to the New Testament authors.
That sounds extremely exciting. And thank you so much for doing such an important work. So, you already mentioned some exact years, some eras. So, but maybe you could tell us, despite that, a bit more about the types and the genre of the pseudepigrapha and from which time or era they do date. Could that be specified in any way, more or less?
Sure, some of them can be
Yeah.
very specified. Some of
Yeah.
them We simply don't know. Part of the difficulty with the pseudepigrapha is almost all of them, even the ones that are demonstrably Jewish, are preserved by Christians.
Hmm.
And being
Hmm.
preserved by Christians, by Christian scribes like to meddle with texts. When they see something about like the coming of the Son of Man, they want to put in something about Jesus, whether that
Okay.
was part
Yeah.
of the original or not. And so part of the difficulty in dating some of this material is discerning where it belongs, whether it's Jewish or Christian, and whether you could even tell. So that's
Hmm.
one of the most difficult issues in
Hmm.
determining the origin of some of these pseudepigrapha. But again, the ones that I deal with are from the Second Temple period, which are essentially non-canonical, not coming from the Apocrypha and not in the Hebrew Bible, and date up through 135 CE. And I use that as a cutoff date because beyond that we get to about 200 CE, and we're starting to talk about the rabbis, which is a fascinating era. But for me, for historical purposes, that gets beyond the scope of what I'm interested in. And that also starts to muddy the waters in terms of Jewish or Christian interference in Jewish. So that makes things complicated. And again, I limit things to that date, to 135. In terms of the genres, this is where things get really fascinating. Some of the genres are very familiar to us, such as apocalypses. So from the canonical books
Yes.
of Daniel, as well as the book of Revelation, we're familiar somewhat with apocalypses. So, and there are a number of apocalypses among the pseudepigrapha. In fact, that's by far the most common genre, is apocalypses. We have books like First Enoch, which is
Hmm.
a collection of apocalypses. Fourth Ezra, Second Baruch, the Apocalypse of Abraham, and one really interesting work called the Sibylline Oracles.
Hmm.
And the
Yeah.
Sibylline Oracles is actually based on non-Jewish traditions that date as early as the 5th century BCE, and is subsequently utilized by Jews and Christians. It's not really an apocalypse, but it does a similar kind of thing. Another genre that's very interesting and that makes sense to those who are familiar with the Bible but are not really attested much in the Bible is a work called a testament. And a testament is sort of like, if you remember from the end of the book of Genesis, for example,
Yes. Yes.
when Jacob is on his deathbed and he summons in his sons and he tells them about this is what he did right, this is what he did wrong, here's what they should do to be faithful to the God of Israel. That is sort of like a miniature testament. And so there's a whole genre of testaments where a patriarch, so there's a work called the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, Testament of Job, the Aramaic Levi document, Testament of Moses, and so forth, that are testament kind of material that do a similar thing, where you have a revered figure in the Old Testament that is pressed into service in this literature to give advice to their progeny that's gathered around their bedside. Now, again, because it's a pseudepigraphon, we know that it's not actually written by Abraham, by Levi, and these other people, but it tells us a lot about the Jewish communities that wrote them and preserved them and what their priorities are. Another work that is pretty unique and is heavily debated is sometimes called rewritten scripture
Hmm.
or rewritten Bible. And that is, those are works that take a portion of biblical text from the Hebrew Bible and essentially recast it with including some things for emphasis, filling in some gaps in some places, and expanding upon the narrative to make a particular point or to make a particular contribution. And so there's one that is called the Genesis Apocryphon, which is actually found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, which rewrites portions of Genesis. And the debate has to do with, are we considering this a copy of Genesis or is this like a companion to Genesis? So exactly how it functioned, it's somewhat debated. And then there's a final category of literature, which includes poetry, wisdom literature, and prayers. Psalms 151 to 155, which are not found in the Hebrew Bible, but are found. Psalm 151 is found in the Apocrypha. 152 to 155 is found among the pseudepigrapha. There's some wisdom literature, again, from Qumran, as well as some other places. And there's a work called the Psalms of Solomon, which is several chapters of poetic literature that's written during the era of the Hasmoneans, sometime early in the 1st century BCE, which describes, among many other things, the coming of a messianic son of David. So we get all kinds of things that are interesting. Again, these are outside the canon, these are beyond the canon, and these are
Yeah.
not canonical, at least in Catholic or Protestant circles. They illuminate the understanding of the thought world of these
Hmm.
writings.
Hmm.
And so, and in anticipation of one of the things we're going to talk about in a minute, late Martin Hengel once said that
Hmm.
if all, something to the effect that if all you know is the Bible, then you really don't know the Bible. Point was that there's a whole literary and cultural and historical context that the authors and the recipients and the participants in these narratives and in these writings are familiar that we know nothing about. And so, in gleaning from these writings and reading some of these writings, we get into some of the thought world and the belief systems that in which the New Testament was written.
There was a great quote you mentioned, and I think everybody, even if someone is as far away from the things we are doing here as you could imagine, should hear and take to heart. It's so important. So, after all your research and your expertise in this field, what would you say? How influential were pseudepigrapha for the development of early Christianity? And could you maybe also give us some specific examples outlining their influence on Christian writings?
The degree to which they're influential on early Christianity is something that's really debated. There are allusions to ideas, for example, with the appearance of the Magi that followed the star in the Gospel of Matthew. There's debate as to whether that star might have been a fallen angel,
Hmm.
because the angels are represented by stars, and falling angels are fallen stars or fallen watchers. There,
Yes.
there's there's debate about that, but where we get really clear examples are again in the book of Jude. The book of Jude, it makes reference to angels that did not keep their own domain, and this is in Jude 5-7, and that comes right from First Enoch chapter 10, where these angels have rebelled against God
Hmm.
and have
Hmm.
fallen to earth. The
Yes.
fallen. There's another example in Jude 9 when we read this bizarre story about the archangel Michael debating with the devil about the body of Moses, which presumably for Jude and his readers that makes perfect sense because he's using that as an illustration. But we as readers who aren't familiar with this with the Jewish traditions have no idea what he's talking about. But this most likely comes from the Testament of Moses, which again is part of a tradition of the Second Temple pseudepigraphic literature. I think probably the most well-known example is that in the book of Jude, verses 14 and 15, where Jude actually quotes from First Enoch 1:9 when he says in Jude 14, about these also Enoch, the seventh from Adam, prophesied, saying, and then he gives a quote. Where's this quote coming from? This quote's from First Enoch 1:9. So these are the most explicit ones. Again, as we look to the book of James, James makes a lot, James is about a lot of endurance and suffering, and he most likely makes reference to ideas from the Testament of Job, which talks, of course, a lot about suffering. These are some of the most well-known ones. There may be one or two others, and again, there's debated as to how much there were of others. The degree to which this has influenced the New Testament, it's clear in these examples, but in other ones it's not so clear. But it does show us, these works do show us that, for example, even if we can't speak to the degree to which the pseudepigrapha helped shape the New Testament or early Christianity, we can understand that it's at least part of the context of Christian origins and the New Testament. So literary, theological, historical context, all of these are written out of certain occasions and settings for certain purposes. And all of this helps us put together what one scholar has called a handful of pieces to a puzzle, and we don't know really what the picture of the puzzle is. Imagine
Yeah.
doing a puzzle and you're given a
Oh,
bunch of
yeah.
pieces and you don't know what the picture is,
Yes.
and you don't know if you have all the pieces. So
Hmm.
you're putting together pieces, and so this is helping us to, if nothing else, to help us to see, for example, what some other Jews of the first century thought about this coming of the Son of David. So we can compare and contrast that with Matthew. Whether one was informed by the other or one was familiar with the other is to some extent irrelevant. It can't be proven one way or the other, but it does show us that there were different people who understood the same concept in a very different way.
I really appreciate that you use so many metaphors and analogies for explaining complicated topics, which is a huge help for me and hopefully to some others of our listeners. So at the end, I would like to ask you a question that we ask many of our interviewees. And that is, why, in your opinion, is it important to read all of these texts today?
I would probably start with suggesting to read some of these texts today, and
Mhm.
not necessarily
Yeah.
all. There's
Yeah.
quite a bit of information. I think it's valuable to recognize that the New Testament is, so we're especially thinking about the New Testament right now, and even beyond canon. Let's think about what the things outside the canon help us to understand about the canon itself. And that is that the New Testament is part of a very broad literary context of the ancient world. It didn't drop down out of the sky. It wasn't written in a historical or literary or theological vacuum. You know, we can read the New Testament and read the book of Revelation and think that's very strange. But when we look at the literature from Second Temple Judaism, the majority of the works, at least that we have among the Pseudepigrapha, were actually apocalypses. So what's strange to us is only strange because we don't read enough of the material and recognize the broader literary context.
Mm-hmm.
It also helps us to see, in my opinion, and this is part of my faith commitment as well, it also helps us to see the uniqueness of the New Testament and of the New Testament canon. And by that I mean, you know, I use the illustration from American basketball. For example, if you think of, you know that, for example, Shaquille O'Neal is a very tall man.
Yes. Yes.
And I've never really realized how tall he was
Yeah.
until I was in college at university, and a friend of mine had a life-size poster of Shaquille O'Neal.
No.
And
Okay.
when you stand next to him, you get an appreciation of just how unique. So my point is to say, for the illustration, is you see how unique the New Testament is by comparing it to these other writings and
Mhm,
saying they're doing something rather
mhm.
different than what the New Testament is doing. So the part of the value in reading some of these is, again, to get to know the thought world, but also to recognize just how unique the New Testament is as a collection of writings within the canon itself. Another value in reading these works is to recognize that all of them are to varying degrees influenced by the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible within a canon, and yet they do very different things with it. So it's very intriguing to recognize the way that the Old Testament canon has actually influenced works to go in very different directions, with sometimes the same kind of traditions. So it helps us to recognize, again, the diversity of the context of the Old Testament canon as well as the New Testament canon.
There was a great plan for interdisciplinary working and for broadening your horizon as long as you possibly can, and to not only look what's in front of you, but to reach out, to look left, to look right, to look, yeah, exactly what we do beyond canon, beyond our own religion in that we grew up, and to compare writings, to compare texts, to compare iconographies within certain cultures. That's something that I take with me after our interview is so extremely important. Thank you so much for highlighting that again. I wish you the best of luck for all your future research you do, and maybe we can dream a little bit. We know that the current situation globally is terrible, but maybe it would be so nice to welcome you personally at our center someday. So maybe we could do that. So keep us updated on whatever you do. We are very looking forward to hear from you. And thank you so much again for today for being our guest.
Thank you for listening to the Beyond Canon podcast.